Hello, everyone. Tonight, we step quietly into the stony belly of a medieval fortress where you find yourself dragging your tired boots across uneven flagstones that have known centuries of footsteps. The torches along the walls flicker, and though they burn brightly, the cold seems to press through the cracks of mortar and between the heavy stones as if light and warmth never agreed to travel together. You pull your cloak tighter, the air sharp enough to sting your nose and cloud your breath. It's bedtime here in a castle that has more drafts than doors. And you're about to discover just how knights, those armored champions who spent their days charging across muddy fields, actually managed to rest when winter sank its claws into the night. You probably won't survive this. Not with your modern central heating expectations. Still, you're gonna try. Now, dim the lights. The stone chamber around you smells faintly of soot, dampness, and a trace of old hay dragged in on someone's boots. No matter how grand the fortress looks from outside, towers thrusting into the night sky, banners stiff in the wind, the interior feels less like luxury and more like a refrigerator made of rock. The truth is, these walls were built for defense, not for comfort. The very thickness that kept arrows out also locked in the chill, turning rooms into echo chambers for whistling drafts. You sit on the edge of a rough wooden bed, feeling that cold climb through the soles of your feet. A mainstream historical fact here. Castles in Northern Europe could see winter nights dip below freezing inside the very rooms where nobles slept. Archaeological studies of drafty great halls show just how little insulation existed. Those thick walls didn't trap heat. They simply stored the cold like a vault. It's no wonder records mention constant fires and layers of clothing, even indoors. And yet, despite such conditions, people still considered castles symbols of wealth. Strange, isn't it, that privilege sometimes meant you froze in grandeur rather than sweating in a cottage near a warm hearth? The psychological toll of this constant, low-grade suffering is often overlooked by historians. You bought the status, but you paid for it every night with physical misery. You shift uneasily on the straw mattress beneath you, listening to the faint drip of water somewhere down the corridor. It's too easy to imagine that drop freezing into a small icicle before morning. The soundscape of your room isn't silence. It's restless. The wind sneaks through the arrow slits, moaning softly like a forgotten choir rehearsing out of tune. The rushes scattered on the floor crunch as you shift your boots. Somewhere a rat rustles. Even the smallest creatures seek warmth in these walls. Your cloak scratches against your chin as you tuck it higher. Shoulders hunched. A knight without armor but still braced for battle this time, against the cold itself. And here's a quirky tidbit. Some chroniclers noted that lords would keep barrels of wine near their beds, not for drinking alone, but to stop the liquid from freezing in storerooms. Imagine tucking into bed, knowing that if your wine remained liquid overnight, you had successfully resisted the cold. If it froze, well, time to rethink your insulation strategy. This test, however arbitrary, underscores the relentless chill that permeated everything. And yet, for all the discomfort, there's a strange peace. You're alive with a roof overhead, safe from the wolves howling beyond the walls. The fire in the great hall still glows faintly, though here its heat doesn't reach. A servant's footsteps echo far away. This is where the nightly routine begins. A battle of wool, fur, and faith against a climate that shows no mercy. Historians still argue whether medieval people truly grew accustomed to the cold or whether they suffered constantly and simply endured it. Some say the human body adapted, hardened by daily exposure, making icy rooms tolerable. Others insist letters, complaints, and court documents reveal constant grumbling about drafts, frost, and sleepless nights. Perhaps like you tonight, they shivered endlessly and prayed for the quick return of dawn. You lie back slowly, letting your head sink onto a lumpy pillow. The straw inside crunches softly, not the luxury of feathers, but serviceable enough. You can almost feel the condensation of your own breath settling against the fabric, moistening it, making it colder still. If you close your eyes, you can sense how nights toughened by days of combat practice patrols, or long marches still struggled here. They might face swords bravely, but here in their chambers, the enemy was frost, and it crept in quietly, unseen, victorious more often than not. The ceiling beams groan in the wind, and you imagine snow piling on the roof, pressing downward with its muffled silence. The night is long, stretching like an unkind guest who refuses to leave. And you, wrapped in your cloak and pressed against that straw mattress, must accept that comfort will never come fully. Sleep will arrive, yes, but only after you've stopped noticing how your toes ache or how your breath lingers in visible clouds. This is your first night in the castle walls, and already you realize surviving until dawn is no small feat. You're still lying there in the stone chamber, your cloak wrapped tightly around your shoulders, when you realize that what keeps you alive through such bitter nights isn't just the fire or the fur on the bed, but the sheer number of layers pressed between your body and the air. Linen, wool, more linen, another piece of wool. It's a game of stacking barriers against the cold until you feel more like a wrapped parcel than a person. Without those layers, you'd be stiff as frozen meat by morning. The first layer clings closest to your skin, usually a simple linen shift, smooth against your body, meant to be washed more often than outer clothes. That fabric is surprisingly practical. It wicks away sweat, keeping the rest of your garments dry. Over that comes wool, coarse and scratchy by modern standards, but precious in its ability to trap heat. You add a second tunic, perhaps a surcoat, then hose for your legs, and thick socks if fortune favors you. Some nights even slept with their boots nearby, though loosening them to avoid cutting off circulation was wise. Imagine trying to dream while your toes turn to icicles. A mainstream historical fact helps here. Medieval wool was not like the soft merino sweaters you know today. It was heavier, denser, and often blended with oils left over from the sheep's fleece. That natural lanolin offered a degree of water resistance, but also produced a faint odor, something between earthy and oily that lingered in every garment. If you're drifting in this chamber, you'll smell it, too, mixing with smoke and damp stone. To medieval noses, that scent wasn't unpleasant. It simply meant survival. This earthy, oily smell was the smell of insurance against hypothermia, a smell far more reassuring than the sterile, cold air. Now, here's a quirky tidbit to make you smile before you tuck your chin deeper into your blanket. Wealthier knights sometimes had nightcaps, not just hats, but full hoods with long tails that could be wrapped under the chin like a scarf. One account describes a nobleman so fond of his cap that he refused to remove it even during late-night meetings, leaving others to wonder whether his loyalty was to God, his lord, or the wool covering his ears. Imagine rolling over in bed, your hood tied tightly, looking more like a bundled onion than a warrior. Covering the head was critical. The medieval mind understood instinctively that heat escaped from exposed skin, making the simple hood a tactical necessity. The layers didn't end with clothing. Blankets woven from wool could be stacked 3 or 4 high. If the household had access to finer cloth, there might be a linen sheet between woolen covers, not for warmth, but for comfort. Linen felt smoother against the skin and was easier to launder. That inner sheet was often the only layer washed regularly, since laundering heavy wool was a complicated ordeal. So, as you drift towards sleep, you're not just snug beneath covers. You're practically entombed in an organized hierarchy of fabric. But scholars still debate just how many layers were considered normal. Some argue that even poorer knights serving under wealthier lords were granted enough linens and woolens to keep from freezing, since a dead retainer was of little use. Others suggest that unless a man was truly wealthy, he scraped by with a single blanket and the clothes he wore that day, relying on sheer toughness to endure. The written records are patchy. Inventories list bedding, but rarely specify quantity. You're left wondering, would you be fortunate cocooned in softness or unfortunate trembling under one itchy cover? Your fingers buried beneath layers begin to thaw. The wool scratches, yes, but it also traps the heat your body gives off. You curl tighter, and the sensation of warmth finally begins to spread inward. Slow but steady, like embers glowing in the marrow of your bones. Outside, The wind rattles its shutters, but you feel the thin boundary between your warm interior world and that endless icy black. It's fragile like a soap bubble in winter, but it exists, and that's enough. You may think of knights as proud figures who strode across battlefields in gleaming armor. Yet in moments like this, their dignity crumbled into the same universal truth. Everyone looks ridiculous, buried beneath too many layers. Imagine one of those proud men, helmet plumes streaming by day, reduced at night to a lumpy mound of wool and linen, snoring under his cap while clutching his blanket like a child. The image is strangely comforting, isn't it? Even the grandest warriors needed bedtime tricks to survive the dark. And so you let yourself settle deeper, appreciating every scratch and fold of fabric. The night is long, the cold is sharp, but with enough layers, you have a fighting chance. Each barrier is a whisper of human ingenuity, a reminder that sometimes victory doesn't come with sword or shield, but with something as humble as wool wrapped twice around your shoulders. You shift your weight on the straw mattress, the chill still creeping through the gaps, when suddenly you notice something curious. The surface beneath you feels different depending on who you are. Not every night, nor every noble slept on the same kind of bedding. What separated a hard night's rest from something almost luxurious was the secret of the mattress itself. Imagine this. A simple soldier collapses on a sack filled with straw. It rustles, scratches, and pricks his skin with tiny stalks. The smell is sharp, almost barn-like, earthy and raw. For him, this is comfort enough, better than frozen ground outside. But if fortune smiled on you, or if you happen to serve a wealthy household, you might recline on a feather mattress. Down and quills stuffed inside linen covers soften the night into something closer to floating than sleeping. That difference, the leap from straw to feathers, was as wide as the chasm between peasant and lord. One well-attested detail from the period tells us that feather beds were prized possessions, often listed in wills alongside land or jewelry. A mattress wasn't just bedding. It was a symbol of status, a declaration that your nights mattered as much as your days. When nobles traveled, their household sometimes carted feather mattresses along with them, folded or rolled, so they wouldn't have to endure common pallets. Just picture the entourage lugging great bundles of bedding up mountain passes while the lord fussed about whether the feathers would flatten in the damp. But there's something almost comic in these accounts, too. Some medieval writers mocked the wealthy for their beds of pride, insisting that soft feathers made men weak. A warrior softened by too much comfort, they claimed, would falter in battle. This moralizing view suggested that a true man of war should embrace discomfort, a rhetoric that conveniently justified the lack of comfort for the lower ranks. And yet, when frost turned every joint to stone, who could really resist the lure of a cushioned retreat? Archaeological digs in old castles have revealed traces of bedding materials, bits of goose down, remains of straw mats, even fragments of rush mats that lay beneath mattresses to protect them from damp floors. The evidence suggests that sleeping arrangements varied wildly. Some rooms held simple pallets laid directly on the ground. Others boasted raised wooden frames to keep the cold earth at bay. Which one you ended up with depended not on merit, but on rank. What might surprise you is how noisy these beds could be. Straw mattresses crunched and shifted with every movement, squeaking almost like crumpled paper. Down beds, on the other hand, had their own quirks. Without careful stitching, feathers poked through the fabric, pricking skin at inconvenient moments. More than one record mentions complaints of quills stabbing the dreamer, turning what should have been luxury into a restless affair. And scholars remain divided on the prevalence of feather mattresses in knights' quarters. Some argue that only the highest nobility enjoyed such luxury, leaving even respectable knights with nothing but straw. Others point to inventories that list feather beds among the belongings of lesser households, suggesting that access was broader than once thought. The debate continues because written sources are inconsistent. One castle might detail dozens of feather mattresses, while another of equal status mentions none. Close your eyes and picture it. You ease yourself down on a mattress stuffed with straw, the scent of dry grass filling your nostrils. It rustles under your shifting body, firm but uneven. Then imagine the alternative, a bed of goose feathers yielding softly, wrapping you like a cloud. The two experiences are worlds apart, yet both were realities within the same castle walls. But even the grandest mattress couldn't erase the cold completely. Feather beds insulated well, trapping body heat, but in a freezing chamber with icy drafts, that warmth leaked away. You still needed heavy blankets and fur throws, so the feather bed was not salvation. It was simply one more layer in the endless war against winter. An odd anecdote survives from the household of a French nobleman. He demanded his servants rotate his feather mattress every 2 weeks, believing the feathers grew weary if always pressed the same way. Whether true or not, you can picture the grumbling attendants flipping a massive sack of goose down while muttering about their lord's fussy superstitions. It shows how even something as ordinary as a mattress became surrounded by ritual, belief, and fuss. The nobleman, perhaps subconsciously, was trying to control the one comfort that was otherwise entirely at the mercy of the cold. And of course, the symbolism of bedding went beyond comfort. In medieval culture, beds were associated with wealth, inheritance, and honor. A knight's reputation might be forged on the battlefield, but his private prestige was displayed in how he slept. Feather mattresses, silk sheets, if available, embroidered covers. These were not just for warmth, but for display, markers of a man's standing in the world. Not every knight cared, of course. Some preferred the plain roughness of straw, declaring it toughened their bodies. But then again, how many of them secretly longed for feathers after a frostbitten patrol? You can almost hear their sighs as they collapsed onto a prickly pallet, whispering to themselves, better than nothing. The scene around you now becomes clearer. You're in your chamber, choosing between two possible realities. On the straw bed, you fight the cold, scratch at stalks, shift to find a comfortable angle, your body complaining with every toss. On the feather bed, you sink into softness, lulled by the sigh of feathers shifting around you, cocooned, but not immune to the icy air that creeps around the curtains. Either way, the night is long. Outside, wind hammers against the walls, rattling shutters, the fire burns low. You know that in a few hours you'll wake, your body stiff and your breath clouding. But for now, you're balanced on that mattress, whether straw or feather, and you let your imagination carry you away. And here's the thought you drift on. No matter how grand the castle, no matter how noble the knight, the battle for warmth was never truly won. The feather bed might feel like a victory, but dawn would always return, and with it, another day of shivering corridors and frosted windows. Still, for these precious hours, you sink into sleep, carried on rustling straw or yielding feathers, and that's enough to survive the coldest nights. The mattress beneath you has given what little relief it can, but soon you realize that bedding alone cannot win the struggle. To truly stand a chance against the night's grip, knights often turn to another solution: animal skins. You draw a heavy pelt over yourself, and instantly the scent hits. Musky, earthy, carrying whispers of the forest it once belonged to. There's no mistaking it. You're not only lying beneath warmth, you're lying beneath a memory of the hunt. Contemporary descriptions of noble households confirm that pelts were among the most valued forms of insulation. Thick hides of deer, bear, wolf, or even boar might be draped across a bed. They were heavy, their weight pressing down like an anchor. But in that pressure came safety. Fur trapped warmth in a way that woven cloth struggled to match. A knight who returned frozen from a patrol would sink into such covers and feel life return slowly to his limbs. The sensation wasn't immediate comfort, but rather a gradual thaw, like fire catching on damp wood, hesitant yet relentless. What's curious is how the type of fur mattered, not only for warmth, but for prestige. Bear skins carried an aura of power linked to the animal's strength. Wolf pelts evoked the wild danger outside the castle walls, now conquered and domesticated on your bed. Deer hides suggested nobility. echoing the hunts that were the privilege of lords. Even the choice of which animal you slept beneath was a kind of silent brag, a nightly reminder of status. The very act of sleeping became a reenactment of the power dynamic between man and nature. One vivid anecdote from a 14th century inventory mentions a noblewoman's bed layered with no fewer than 8 pelts, each trimmed with embroidery. Can you imagine? The hides themselves spoke of hunting prowess, but the stitching turned them into art. A visitor peeking into that chamber would see not just warmth, but wealth stitched into every seam. Yet, there's another side to this story, the smell. Unlike clean wool, pelts often retain the sense of tanning oils, animal musk, or lingering damp. Imagine curling beneath fur and catching a whiff of something halfway between leather and barnyard. It was effective, yes, but never fully refined. Some chronicles even joke about knights crawling in a bed, only to be reminded of the very beast they fought earlier that year. Sleep came wrapped in reminders that the wild was never far away. Archaeological remains also suggest practical uses. Fur throws doubled as cloaks during travel. A knight on campaign might roll a pelt into his pack, sleeping beneath it in the open fields one night and laying it across his castle bed the next. Portability mattered. Unlike massive feather mattresses, pelts could follow a man wherever he roamed, making them an adaptable defense against both drafty chambers and frozen battle camps. What might amuse you is the way some chroniclers described noble arguments about fur ownership. Families passed down particular pelts as heirlooms, almost as if they were jewels. Brothers quarreled over who inherited the great bear skin, believing it too valuable to be split. When you pause to think about it, the idea of warriors bickering like children over a blanket feels oddly human, doesn't it? The most stoic of men still fought over the one item that could guarantee a better night's rest. And specialists today still debate how widespread the use of pelts truly was. Some argue that every knightly household possessed at least a few, since hunting was both sport and necessity. Others caution that written records skew toward elites, leaving us to wonder whether lesser retainers relied on coarse wool alone. Excavations reveal scraps of fur in modest dwellings, too, suggesting pelts weren't solely noble luxuries. The evidence remains tantalizing but incomplete. As you lie here in your imagined chamber, you can feel the texture of fur beneath your fingertips, coarse guard hairs on the outside, softer undercoat pressed against your skin. There's a strange intimacy to it, a reminder that the line between civilization and wilderness was thin. Each night, knights cocooned themselves, not just in cloth woven by human hands, but in the skins of creatures that once prowled the same forests where hunts were staged. The bed itself became a meeting point between man and nature. Close your eyes, and the sensation deepens. The weight of pelts holds you steady, grounding you almost like an embrace from the earth itself. Beyond the shuttered windows, wolves howl at the moon, their cries piercing the stillness. Inside, one of their cousins lies across your chest, no longer a threat, but a shield. It's unsettling and comforting at once. There's another curious practice worth noting. Pelts sometimes line the insides of bed curtains, creating miniature caves of warmth. Picture drawing heavy drapes around you, their inner surfaces fur-lined, transforming your bed into a den. You'd crawl inside, close the curtains, and suddenly you weren't a knight in a drafty chamber anymore. You were something closer to an animal in hibernation. And perhaps that's exactly what Cole demanded. Surrendering pride, mimicking the beasts, and letting instinct carry you through the season. Of course, this all had limits. Even the warmest fur couldn't block every draft. When the fire in the hearth died low, when the wind knifed through cracks in the shutters, the chill would sneak back in. You might pull pelts tighter, bury your nose in their folds, and still wake to frost clinging to your beard. Nothing in a medieval castle was absolute protection. Comfort was relative, measured not by how cozy you felt, but by whether you survived the night with your blood still flowing. And yet, imagine the psychological comfort. After hours of icy corridors, clanking armor, or relentless training in the yard, crawling beneath pelts must have felt like a victory. You could almost hear your body sigh with relief, muscles unclenching, breath slowing, warmth creeping back in. It wasn't luxury by modern terms, but it was survival wrapped in fur. So, as you drift deeper into this imagined night, you tug the pelt higher. The musk fades as your senses dull, leaving only weight and warmth. Outside, snow drifts pile higher against the stone walls. Somewhere servants bank the fire with the last scraps of wood. And you, night of the cold season, surrender to sleep beneath the silent guardianship of animals whose skins have become your fortress within a fortress. The pelts are heavy across your body, but still the cold creeps in at the edges. You start to understand why a castle never relied on bedding alone. There's a fire across the room, its glow faint against the damp stone. The hearth is the beating heart of your chamber, and yet it feels like a distant ally, flickering bravely but failing to reach the furthest corners. You watch the flames lean and dance, their light trembling across the carved mantle, and realize how central fire was to every medieval night. One well-known fact about castle architecture is that fireplaces weren't always part of the earliest designs. Many great halls originally had open hearths in the center of the floor, smoke venting upward through a louver in the roof. Later, as construction improved, wall-mounted fireplaces with chimneys became common, especially in private chambers. These were marvels for their time, directing smoke away while offering a focused source of heat. Without them, the rooms would have been choking clouds of ash. With them, at least you could breathe while you shivered. But let's be honest, those fireplaces, noble as they looked, were still tragically inefficient. The heat they produced mostly escaped up the chimney, while drafts poured in from windows and doors. You can imagine it now, sitting close to the blaze, your face flushed warm, while your back stays icy. The contrast is almost comical. Half your body in summer, half in winter all at once. What might amuse you is how people tried to outwit that imbalance. Some households used great metal firebacks decorated with patterns or coats of arms to reflect heat outward into the room. Others experimented with screens or angled stones, hoping to trap warmth. None of these tricks solved the problem entirely, but they showed a kind of medieval ingenuity born of desperation. Even in castles, warmth was a puzzle no one fully mastered. This ingenuity was driven by the knowledge that wasted heat was wasted money, making the hearth a central economic concern. A curious account from a 15th century manor mentions servants ordered to keep the fire burning throughout the night, not for light, but simply to ensure the lord could rise at dawn without shivering. You can picture the weary attendant creeping into the chamber at midnight, tossing on another log, stifling a cough as the master stirred. Fire wasn't just a convenience. It demanded constant human labor. Heat was as much about effort as it was about fuel. And that fuel itself tells another story. Castles consumed staggering amounts of wood. Whole forests were managed to supply logs for hearths and kitchens. Some households supplemented with peat or coal, though the smoke often smelled foul. When shortages came, fires burned lower, and those nights must have felt endless. Scholars continue to discuss whether these shortages influenced winter routines. Did households ration firewood? Did knights spend more time in communal halls to share warmth, leaving private chambers cold and unused? The written record doesn't give us a simple answer. Now, let's pull back into your chamber. You're tucked beneath furs, but your eyes keep drifting toward the flames. The sound of crackling wood is soothing, a soft counterpoint to the wind outside. Sparks leap like tiny stars, fading before they touch the floor. The smoke curls upward, disappearing into the chimney's throat. For a moment, the fire makes you feel secure, as if the cold will stay on the other side of the stone walls. But then shift a little farther from the hearth, and you notice how quickly the warmth dissolves. At the bed's edge, it's already gone. The air against your skin feels heavy and damp again. Fire gave only localized comfort. Unless you slept right next to it, which risked sparks and burns, you could never escape the chill entirely. Here's an odd little practice worth picturing. Some lords had their beds positioned directly beside the fireplace. close enough that the heat touched the heavy curtains enclosing them. Servants worried about stray sparks, but the masters insisted. Better a scorched drape than a frozen nose. It's almost endearing, the thought of a mighty knight arranging his bed like a child scooting closer to the campfire. Archaeological surveys of castles show how fireplaces were built into walls thick enough to walk inside. Some even had secret passages for servants to add fuel without disturbing the sleeper. Imagine dozing off and never realizing a boy had slipped behind the wall to feed the flames. His presence hidden, his task unacknowledged. Warmth in such a chamber came not just from stone and wood, but from invisible human hands keeping vigil through the night. And yet, even with this engineering, even with all that labor, the fire was still an unreliable ally. You might wake at dawn to find frost creeping along the inside of your shutters, ice crystals etched like lace across the wood. Your breath hangs in the air despite the embers still glowing red. Comfort was never absolute. It was relative, fleeting, and fragile. The fireplace, though grand, was a monument to limited technological capability against overwhelming natural forces. As you drift now, picture yourself half asleep, watching firelight ripple across the ceiling beams. The warmth brushes your cheeks, but refuses to follow you into slumber. You know you'll wake cold again, but for now there's a lullaby in the crackle, a reassurance that the night is at least being fought, even if never conquered. That's the paradox of the castle hearth, a symbol of wealth, effort, and ingenuity, yet always a reminder that even the richest night still shivered. The fire burned, but the cold always returned. Still, it gave enough to quiet your heart, to still your thoughts, and to let sleep finally come. Even on the bitterest nights, the hearth has burned low now, its embers sighing more than crackling. You turn under your pelts, grateful for what little warmth remains, when you notice a smaller glow nearby. Not the great fire in the wall, but something humbler, portable braziers. These iron or bronze bowls filled with glowing coals were scattered through chambers like glowing guardians of the night. They're less impressive than a roaring hearth, but they gave heat exactly where you needed it most, close to your body, near your bed, by your frozen hands. Period records describe how households relied on these portable heaters, not just in bedrooms, but in hallways, chapels, and even drafty stairwells. Imagine carrying one carefully by its handles, the coals shifting like red jewels inside. Set it beside your bed, and suddenly the air warms just enough for your fingers to unclench. Without it, the cold feels endless. With it, you can finally breathe without shivering. Archaeological finds confirm their widespread use. Metal braziers with soot stains still visible, some decorated with patterns of leaves or animals. These weren't only functional, they carried artistry, too, a reminder that even survival could be made beautiful. You'd fall asleep with a faint orange glow at your side, shadows flickering like candlelight, but deeper, steadier, almost hypnotic. What's striking is how risky they were. Braziers consumed oxygen and filled chambers with smoke if not properly vented. There are stories of households overcome by fumes, slipping into unconsciousness, never to wake again. One chronicle warns of knights who sought warmth in war, and who died of the smoke in their peacetime beds. The allure of localized heat was often a Faustian bargain, trading comfort for a hidden, creeping peril. Servants had to be vigilant, frequently opening doors or windows to ventilate the stone rooms, a counterproductive act that let in the very cold they were fighting. This dangerous dependency led to a less flashy, yet far safer, alternative for the bed: the heated stone or brick wrapped in cloth. Imagine a block of soapstone or a smooth river rock, heated carefully near the great hall fire, then wrapped tightly in a thick piece of wool or linen. This was the medieval equivalent of a hot water bottle. You'd place it at the foot of your straw mattress, and for hours, it would radiate a steady, non-toxic heat. The beauty of the heated stone was its simplicity and its complete safety. It didn't consume oxygen or produce fumes. It was a purely passive heat, a small anchor of warmth in the vast ocean of cold. This practice was especially favored for the elderly, the sick, or noble women, but any man who could command a servant to fetch and prepare one on a bitter night would happily accept it. It was warmth without drama, survival without peril. As you picture the night, you might have both. The brazier sits in the corner, throwing a weak circle of warmth into the air, while beneath your stacked blankets, the smooth, linen-wrapped stone presses against your feet. It's a localized, personal fortress of heat. The stone is a subtle, almost secret comfort, a testament to the fact that the battle for warmth was won not by grand architecture, but by small, persistent acts of human ingenuity. The charcoal in the brazier crackles faintly, a sound that quickly becomes another rhythm of the night. The stone slowly cools, the heat withdrawing into the fabric and the straw. You know its comfort is finite, that it will be cold and inert by morning. But for these crucial hours, it performs its simple, vital duty. It allows the knight, who faces death by sword or lance with a steady heart, to finally, quietly, surrender to sleep, safe from the cold's silent, domestic ambush. The cold is a ruthless opponent, but tonight, you have outsmarted it with a rock. But the warmth you've managed to capture is isolated, a tiny island against a frozen ocean. The chill of the castle doesn't just come from the air, it seeps up from the ground itself. You're lying on a raised bed, which helps, but what about the rest of the floor? Medieval people did not have wall-to-wall carpeting, but they did have rushes, layers of straw, and various aromatic plants scattered across the stone. This wasn't just for decoration or comfort underfoot. It was a crucial, if primitive, layer of insulation. The rushes provided a thin, organic barrier between frozen flagstones and the air, reducing the immediate transfer of cold. A thick layer of fresh, dry straw could hold a surprising amount of trapped air, acting as a kind of organic carpet. You can hear the dry, crisp crunch of them whenever you shift your weight or whenever a servant passes in the corridor. Historians note that fresh rushes also served a sanitary purpose, absorbing dirt, spills, and perhaps masking less pleasant odors. But in winter, their primary role shifted entirely to the defense against the cold. Imagine the difference between stepping barefoot onto a raw stone floor versus a layer of dry, insulating reeds. The former is a shock, the latter, a mere prickle of chill. The problem, of course, was that rushes eventually became damp, dirty, and a perfect haven for fleas, mice, and other undesirable creatures. They would have to be periodically replaced, a great labor usually reserved for special occasions or seasonal cleanings. So, the bedding beneath your feet might be months old, carrying the faint, earthy scent of decay mixed with the dry, grassy aroma of what little hay has been recently added. This detail, the simple rush on the floor, speaks volumes about the constant, low-level effort required just to maintain a basic level of livability inside a stone fortress. Every layer, every object, from the thickest fur on your bed to the thinnest layer of straw on the floor, was a deliberate act of survival. And as you drift, you realize that your little warm patch of mattress and stone is entirely surrounded by these simple, essential barriers, holding the cold at bay just long enough for you to rest. But your experience only reflects the elite. As the deepest hour of the night approaches, you must pull back the curtain and look beyond your privileged, isolated space to see how the majority of the castle population truly endured. Private chambers were a luxury. Communal warmth was a necessity. For the castle's servants, lower-ranking retainers, and simple soldiers, the bitter cold often forced a mass migration to the Great Hall. This massive room, with its central or largest hearth, was too vast to be truly warm, but it was warmer than any other unheated stone corner. When the feasting was done and the tables were cleared, the hall became an impromptu, crowded dormitory. Imagine the scene. You step out of your chamber's quietude and into a landscape of bundled, sleeping forms. Bodies are laid out on rush-strewn floors, packed tightly together not for companionship, but for convective heat transfer. Men, and sometimes women, slept head to toe, creating human chains that minimized the surface area exposed to the icy air. The soundscape here is entirely different. A low, continuous murmur of snores, coughs, the rustle of straw pallets, and the heavy breathing of dozens of people sharing the same space. This was the ultimate survival hack: shared body heat. And the most desired sleeping companions weren't always human. For the lowest-ranking soldiers or kitchen boys, the castle dogs were prized. These large hounds, used for guarding or hunting by day, became furry, living hot water bottles by night. Snuggling against a large, warm animal was an ancient, practical comfort that transcended social barriers. A dog's rhythmic breathing and dense coat provided hours of reliable, non-fuming heat, a better companion than many human bedfellows. The term bedfellows itself took on a purely pragmatic meaning in these conditions. It was a common, non-romantic necessity for two or more individuals to share a narrow pallet simply to stay alive. Court records contain amusing, and sometimes sad, complaints about snoring, restless, or overly cuddlesome companions. Yet, the alternative was often a far more brutal cold, underscoring that in the medieval winter, practicality trumped privacy. The irony is stark. The Lord, isolated in his grand, drafty room with his feather bed and dangerous brazier, fights a lonely, sophisticated battle against the cold. The servant, clustered with dozens of others on a straw pallet in the great hall, endures a rougher environment, but is, ironically, often physically warmer due to sheer proximity and shared body mass. His survival depends on the community he sleeps within. As you stand in the archway, looking at the silent, bundled forms, the wind momentarily stills outside, and you hear only the gentle crackle of the banked embers in the hall's immense hearth. You realize that the castle isn't just a defensive structure. It's a living, breathing ecosystem of warmth distribution. The cold forces everyone into uncomfortable closeness, stripping away the hierarchy built by day. For a few hours, all are equal. Warriors, servants, dogs, and knights, all simply striving to make it to the dawn. The coldest night in the castle, you find, is survived not by luxury, but by humanity piled upon humanity. But what about the knight's armor? It's resting in the corner, a cold, empty shell. You might imagine that armor, being metal, would draw all the heat out of the room, turning the corner into an industrial icebox. And it did. The cold of the castle created a new problem for the knight, waking up and having to don a second skin of frozen steel. This was not a minor inconvenience. Touching bare skin to frozen metal can cause rapid injury. The chilling reality of cold armor forced a particular common practice among the elite: keeping the armor close to the fire. Not so close as to risk permanent damage to the leather linings, but near enough to the great hall's hearth or a chamber brazier to prevent the metal from reaching a freezing temperature. Imagine the clanking, shimmering presence of a knight's full harness, set up like a ghostly sentry near the dying embers. This practice tells us something crucial about the knight's priorities. His armor was his life, his identity, and his most valuable asset. The cold was a daily threat to its usefulness. Frozen armor meant a delayed or impossible reaction in an emergency. What if the castle were attacked at first light? He couldn't risk having to spend precious minutes rubbing the frost off his gauntlets or trying to force stiff, ice-bound joints into his breastplate. The logistics of this were complicated. A page or a squire was often tasked with the specific, delicate duty of keeping watch over the master's gear, ensuring the metal remained dry and slightly above ambient temperature. In a noble's chamber, the armor might be draped with blankets or even a spare fur pelt to insulate it from the worst of the cold air, a testament to the value placed on a functional suit of plate. There's a fascinating, practical anecdote that survives, suggesting that some knights would place their linen undergarments, the chemise they wore beneath their padding, inside the armor itself overnight. This seemingly odd practice served two functions. First, it ensured the lining remained dry and warm, making the initial dressing less torturous. Second, the slight warmth of the garment might transfer to the steel, making it marginally less shocking against the skin. It's a detail that captures the constant, low-grade suffering and the small, clever fixes necessary for survival. The knight, master of the battlefield, was reduced to using his own clothing to preemptively warm his equipment, not for comfort, but for immediate readiness. His very rest was conditional on the preparedness of his cold, metallic skin resting just meters away. The battle against the cold permeated every aspect of his professional life. The knight is safely asleep, the castle hushed. But the quiet is deceptive. The castle never truly sleeps. It is merely waiting for the morning routine, which itself was another, equally chilling ordeal. To survive the night was one thing. To face the morning, still stiff and heavy with cold, was another. The first duty of any nobleman was not breakfast, but ablutions, the act of washing. Forget running warm water. The water in the ewer and basin, often kept in a corner of the chamber, would be near freezing, possibly with a thin skim of ice on its surface. Washing oneself on a stone floor in a room where breath still clouded the air required genuine fortitude. A nobleman who insisted on maintaining his standards of cleanliness, however basic by modern measures, faced a daily, painful shock. This is why, in many households, hot water was considered an immense luxury, reserved for the sick or for high ceremony. The effort required to heat vast cauldrons of water over the great hall fire and then transport them in heavy buckets up several flights of cold, narrow stairs was staggering. It required enormous labor and fuel and was simply not practical for daily use. However, scholars have noted that wealthier households had a compromise. They might only wash hands and face with warm water, transported painstakingly by a servant. The rest of the body would be dealt with via quick wiping with linen cloths, often lightly scented to mask odors, a practical solution to an impossible thermal problem. Scent was often preferred over soap. The knight, therefore, didn't start his day with a refreshing shower. He started it with a gasp and a wince. This moment of voluntary immersion into the cold water served as a brutal daily test of discipline and toughness. It was a reaffirmation that despite his warm bedding, he was still a hardened warrior, capable of enduring discomfort without complaint. This daily shock was a mandatory rite of passage. The cold extended beyond the body and the armor. It permeated the written records of the castle. Scribes, clerks, and scholars often wrote in conditions that would make modern office workers weep. Imagine trying to form precise script with a quill pen when the ink pot is threatening to freeze. This wasn't a rare occurrence. It was a common winter nuisance. Historical documents, particularly those from Northern Europe, occasionally mention the need to keep ink pots near a small source of heat, perhaps a tiny candle or a personal brazier, to maintain the ink in a liquid state. This struggle gave rise to a clever, practical solution: the use of warming pans filled with embers, often placed beneath the writing table or desk. This need to keep fluids liquid impacted more than just ink. The wine and beer served at the morning meal might have a frosty layer on top, requiring a servant to break the thin crust of ice before the noble could drink. Food, too, cooled instantly. A hot meal transported from the kitchen to the private chamber in a distant tower could lose much of its heat crossing the cold, stone corridors, arriving lukewarm or actively cold. This leads to a fascinating detail about castle logistics: the great distances between the main kitchen, which had the largest fire, and the private chambers. This distance was often strategically intentional, to reduce the risk of fire spreading to the main living quarters. But it created a thermal nightmare for the servants whose duty it was to deliver warmth in the form of food. Special insulated carriers, often simple wooden boxes lined with thick cloth or hay, were used to minimize the heat loss during transit. Even so, the knight learned to eat quickly, gulping down his food before the residual heat vanished entirely. The morning meal was less about leisurely enjoyment and more about a swift, calculated intake of calories necessary to face the day's renewed cold. The entire castle life was a race against the temperature. The morning's greatest psychological battle was getting dressed. The layers of clothing you took off the night before, wool tunic, hose, linen shift, were now heavy, cold, and slightly stiff with accumulated dampness from your own breath and the ambient humidity. Putting on these clothes felt like pulling on a wet sack. This is where the role of the squire or page became paramount. These young men weren't just personal assistants. They were thermal engineers for the knight's body. Their duties included the delicate, necessary task of warming the master's garments. How did they warm them? Simple. They used the hearth. The clothes would be held near the fire's heat, not so close as to scorch the precious wool, but just long enough to drive out the moisture and introduce a whisper of warmth. You can picture the squire holding the heavy tunic aloft, slowly rotating it near the dying embers, his face red from the heat, while the knight shivered impatiently. This gesture, a servant warming his master's clothes, was a profound act of domestic care, a necessary ritual that transformed a potential torture into a bearable experience. The morning bell rings again, signaling the start of the full day. The brief, fragile victory of surviving the night is over. You stand now, fully layered, slightly stiff, but alive. The cold remains, but you are ready.